Control of the pharmaceutical ingredients. In the autumn and winter of 2022, a phenomenon deeply unsettling to the collective psyche of the developed world began to unfold across the United States and Europe. It was a season marked by a convergence of respiratory illnesses, a triple-demic of respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, influenza, and the lingering presence of COVID-19 that sent pediatric hospitalization rates climbing. Yet the panic that ensued was not solely a result of the viruses themselves, but rather a sudden stark realization of the fragility of the systems designed to treat them. Parents arriving at pharmacies to fill prescriptions for Amoxicillin, a standard pink bubblegum-flavored antibiotic liquid used for decades to treat common ear infections and strep throat, were met with a reality that had previously been the domain of the developing world or wartime economies: empty shelves. This was not a localized logistical hiccup caused by a snowstorm or a regional trucking strike. It was a systemic failure that forced families to drive across state lines in desperate searches for medication, prompted pharmacists to ration liquid suspensions, and compelled doctors to prescribe less effective, broader-spectrum alternatives that carried higher risks of side effects and antibiotic resistance. The shortage of such a ubiquitous drug, a chemical commodity that has been off patent for nearly half a century and costs pennies to manufacture, shattered the illusion of pharmaceutical abundance that Western consumers had taken for granted. It revealed a stark, uncomfortable truth that had been developing quietly for decades. The global supply chain for essential medicines has become dangerously thin, geographically concentrated, and profoundly opaque. The crisis of 2022 was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a much deeper structural transformation in the global economy. The pill dispensed at a local pharmacy in Ohio or Bavaria is merely the final visible artifact of a sprawling, convoluted industrial journey that spans continents and oceans. While the brand name on the box may suggest a domestic or Western origin, perhaps the logo of a trusted American or Swiss pharmaceutical giant, the molecular soul of the drug, the active ingredients, and the chemical precursors that create them is almost certainly sourced from thousands of miles away. The pharmaceutical industry, once a vertically integrated powerhouse where companies manufactured their own chemicals in local facilities, has fragmented into a complex web of horizontal dependencies. This analysis, the first of a two-part review, aims to map this invisible terrain. It explores the granular mechanics of pharmaceutical control, dissecting the journey from raw earth to finished pill, and examining the geopolitical and economic forces that have centralized the world's medicine chest in East Asia. By understanding the invisible pipeline that feeds the healthcare systems of the West, we can begin to comprehend the magnitude of the stakes involved. The control of pharmaceutical ingredients is no longer merely a matter of commercial efficiency. It has become a central pivot of global health security and national sovereignty. To understand the vulnerability of the modern pharmaceutical supply chain, one must first demystify the physical and chemical journey of a drug. The public perception of pharmaceutical manufacturing often focuses on the final stage, the pressing of powder into tablets, the filling of vials in sterile, white-walled facilities, or the packaging of blister packs into cardboard boxes. This stage, known in the industry as finished dosage form manufacturing, is merely the assembly phase, akin to screwing the wheels onto a car or placing a microchip into a smartphone case. The true engineering challenge, the bulk of the cost, and the strategic choke point of the entire industry lie upstream in the chemical synthesis of the ingredients themselves. The journey begins with raw materials, which are often basic commodities indistinguishable from those used in heavy industry. These are not medicinal in nature. They are the elemental building blocks of modern chemistry. They include hydrocarbon derivatives like benzene and toluene, harvested from petroleum refining, mined minerals, or biological substrates like corn steep liquor used in fermentation processes. These raw materials are fed into massive chemical reactors, often located in sprawling industrial parks that resemble oil refineries more than medical laboratories, to produce intermediates. Intermediates are the transient species of the chemical world. They are molecules that have been chemically altered but are not yet medicinal. They serve as the scaffolding for the final drug. A complex pharmaceutical molecule may require 10, 20, or even 30 synthetic steps, with each step creating a new intermediate that must be isolated, purified, and reacted again. These early stages of production are characterized by high volumes, high waste generation, and significant environmental impact. Consequently, they are often pushed to the very bottom of the supply chain, to regions where industrial zoning allows for the handling of hazardous reagents and volatile organic compounds. As the chemical synthesis progresses, the molecules become more complex and exponentially more valuable. The process eventually yields key starting materials, or KSMs. The distinction between a raw material, an intermediate, and a KSM is not merely chemical but regulatory. And this distinction is one of the most critical battlegrounds in the pharmaceutical supply chain. According to international guidelines such as ICH-Q11, a KSM is the point where good manufacturing practices, or GMP standards, the rigorous, expensive safety and quality protocols enforced by agencies like the FDA and EMA, formally begin. Steps prior to the KSM are generally considered non-GMP, meaning they are subject to significantly less regulatory scrutiny regarding their manufacturing conditions, documentation, and traceability. This regulatory line in the sand creates a powerful economic incentive for pharmaceutical companies to designate the KSM as late in the synthesis process as possible. By classifying complex chemicals as non-GMP intermediates rather than KSMs, companies can source them from chemical plants that do not need to maintain pharmaceutical-grade clean rooms or extensive quality documentation, significantly lowering costs. This practice has created a massive gray zone in the supply chain, a pre-KSM space that is largely invisible to Western regulators but essential to the production of the final drug. The culmination of this chemical relay race is the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API. The API is the biologically active substance that creates the therapeutic effect, the ibuprofen that reduces the fever, the atorvastatin that lowers the cholesterol, or the amoxicillin that kills the bacteria. It is the most regulated, capital-intensive, and critical component of any drug. Once the API is synthesized, often in a dedicated facility, it is shipped to a separate factory, potentially in a different country, to be combined with excipients, inactive fillers, binders, coatings, and stabilizers, to create the finished dosage form that reaches the patient. This journey is rarely contained within a single border. A typical supply chain for a generic drug might involve raw petrochemicals mined in the Middle East, refined into basic intermediates in a massive chemical park in Shandong Province, China, converted to advanced KSMs in a neighboring facility, shipped to India for synthesis into an API, and finally exported to a facility in Germany or the United States for tableting and packaging. This fragmentation means that a disruption at any single node, a factory explosion in China, a trade dispute in India, a shipping bottleneck in the Suez Canal, or an environmental crackdown in Hebei, can cascade downstream, leaving a patient in a rural American town without essential medication. The opacity of this chain is profound. Under current regulations, drug companies are often not required to disclose the country of origin of the API on the patient label, leaving consumers and even healthcare providers blind to the geographic risks embedded in their medicine. The strategic gravity of the pharmaceutical industry has shifted decisively toward the production of APIs and their upstream precursors. APIs are the numerator of the drug equation. Without them, the denominator of formulation capacity is irrelevant. The concentration of API manufacturing is the primary driver of modern drug shortages and represents a significant shift in global health security. The dependency is not uniform across all medicines, but is particularly acute in the market for generic drugs. Generics, which account for the vast majority of prescriptions filled in the United States and Europe, some estimates place this as high as 90% of all prescriptions by volume, operate on razor-thin profit margins. In this commoditized environment, the slight cost advantage gained by sourcing APIs from a cheaper supplier can determine the survival of a manufacturer. This economic Darwinism has driven the mass exodus of API manufacturing from the West to the East over the past 3 decades. The criticality of APIs is illustrated by the volume dependency phenomenon. While there may be dozens of pharmaceutical companies selling a generic antibiotic like piperacillin tazobactam under different brand names, investigations have revealed that these competitors often source their API from the exact same factory in China. This creates a diamond supply chain structure: broad diversity at the top, many brands, and broad diversity at the bottom, many raw material suppliers, but a dangerous pinch point in the middle, where global supply relies on a single facility. When that single facility fails, as occurred in 2016 when the Qilu pharmaceutical factory in Jinan exploded, the illusion of market diversity collapses, and the entire globe faces a simultaneous shortage. Furthermore, the battleground extends deeper than just the API. Key starting materials, KSMs, and specialized reagents have become hidden choke points. For instance, the production of many sterile injectables and antibiotics require specific solvents like acetonitrile or specialized catalysts. If the production of a niche solvent is concentrated in a single industrial park that is shut down for environmental inspections, the production of APIs dependent on that solvent halts, regardless of the API factory's own operational status. The interconnectedness of the chemical industry means that pharmaceutical supply is inextricably linked to the broader industrial chemical economy, sharing upstream vulnerabilities with industries as diverse as plastics, paints, and agriculture. The modern pharmaceutical landscape is thus defined not by the finished pills on the pharmacy shelf, but by the flow of these invisible powders and liquids. Control over the API and its precursors equates to control over the finished product. As the analysis moves to the specific dominance of China in this sector, it becomes clear that this control has been consolidated to a degree that is unprecedented in the history of medicine. China's pharmaceutical ascendancy. The story of China's rise to pharmaceutical dominance is not merely one of cheap labor or inevitable globalization, but of a deliberate, decades-long industrial strategy that capitalized on the economic vulnerabilities and strategic myopia of the West. In the late 20th century, the United States and Europe were the undisputed leaders in antibiotic and API production. Facilities like the Bristol-Myers Squibb plant in Syracuse, New York, were industrial landmarks, producing the bulk of the world's penicillin and serving as critical assets for national health security. However, the 1990s and 2000s brought a convergence of factors that eroded this leadership and shifted the center of gravity to East Asia. The primary driver was the changing economics of antibiotic and generic drug production. As patents expired and drugs became commodities, Western manufacturers faced intensifying pressure to reduce costs. Simultaneously, environmental regulations in the West were tightening. The chemical synthesis of drugs, particularly the fermentation processes used for antibiotics and the synthesis of complex organic molecules, is inherently dirty. It produces substantial amounts of waste, odors, and chemical effluents that require expensive treatment technologies to manage safely. Western companies, driven by shareholder capitalism's demand for quarterly efficiency and higher margins, began to view API manufacturing as a low-value, high-liability asset. They sought to divest these dirty processes to regions with lower costs and laxer oversight. China welcomed this offloading with open arms. The Chinese government identified pharmaceuticals as a strategic pillar of growth, designating it a high value-added industry in multiple 5-year plans. To attract this capacity, Beijing deployed a potent mix of industrial subsidies, cheap land, low-cost energy, and crucially, an initial disregard for environmental externalities. The pollution haven hypothesis posits that dirty industries migrate to jurisdictions with the weakest regulations. For 2 decades, this facilitated the mass migration of chemical manufacturing to Chinese provinces like Hebei, Shandong, and Zhejiang. The tipping point for U.S. domestic capacity is epitomized by the closure of the Bristol-Myers Squibb Syracuse facility in 2004. Once a crown jewel of American manufacturing, established in 1943 to answer the U.S. government's call for large-scale penicillin production during World War II, the plant could no longer compete with the flood of inexpensive fermentation products arriving from Asia. Its closure marked the end of significant U.S. capacity to manufacture penicillin APIs. The equipment was auctioned off, much of it reportedly heading to China, and the intellectual capital, the generations of chemical engineers who knew how to run these complex fermentation vats, dispersed. This pattern was repeated across the Western world. By the time Western governments recognized the strategic error, the infrastructure was gone, and the expertise had atrophied. Economic incentives went beyond simple deregulation. The Chinese state provided direct financial support to build massive industrial parks where pharmaceutical companies could integrate vertically. Unlike Western models where a factory might stand alone, Chinese chemical industrial parks offered an ecosystem where steam, chlorine, waste treatment, and energy were supplied centrally, often at subsidized rates. This over-the-fence model drastically reduced overhead for individual factories. For example, a factory making an antibiotic precursor needs vast amounts of hazardous reagents like thionyl chloride or specialized solvents. In the US, these would likely have to be trucked in, adding cost and regulatory burden. In a Chinese park, they are piped in from the supplier next door. Waste from the antibiotic factory might be piped out to a centralized treatment plant or used as feedstock for another process. This integration creates extreme efficiency and cost competitiveness that isolated Western plants cannot match. Furthermore, the Chinese value-added tax rebate system incentivized exports. By offering rebates of up to 13% on exported pharmaceutical ingredients, the government effectively subsidized foreign buyers to switch to Chinese sources. An Indian or European drug company comparing a Chinese supplier to a domestic competitor saw an immediate state-sponsored price advantage baked into the Chinese quote. This policy decimated the Indian fermentation industry in the 2000s, driving Indian companies to shut down their own fermenters and become importers of Chinese penicillin G and other intermediates. This ascent was further solidified by the Chinese Made in China 2025 initiative, which explicitly targeted the pharmaceutical sector for development, aiming to move from producing basic chemicals to dominating the market for complex APIs and biologics. The state channeled capital into the sector, with Chinese chemical and pharmaceutical companies investing over 156 billion euros in their plants in 2024 alone, more than any other country in the world. This investment created massive capacity, often exceeding global demand, which allowed Chinese firms to drop prices to levels that drove foreign competitors out of the market entirely. Once the competitors exited, the Chinese firms gained pricing power and market dominance. Illustrating the scale. The result of this strategic maneuvering is a level of market dominance that is difficult to overstate. Today, China is the world's largest producer of active pharmaceutical ingredients. While precise figures fluctuate due to the opacity of the market and the gray zone of KSMs, data consistently indicates that China accounts for approximately 40% of global API production by volume. However, this aggregate figure masks near-total monopolies in specific critical categories of medicine that are essential for modern healthcare. The world's dependence on China for antibiotics is particularly staggering. Estimates suggest that China produces between 80 and 90% of the global supply of antibiotic APIs. For specific classes of drugs, the concentration is absolute. The production of penicillin G, the foundational precursor for nearly all penicillin-based antibiotics, including amoxicillin, ampicillin, and piperacillin, is concentrated in the hands of a few massive Chinese conglomerates, primarily located in the provinces of Shandong and Henan. Without access to these Chinese factories, the global production of these life-saving drugs would grind to a halt. India is often touted as the pharmacy of the world due to its massive generic drug industry and its role as a major supplier of finished pills to the US and Europe. However, this moniker is deceptive. While India manufactures a huge volume of finished pills, FDFs, its industry is structurally dependent on Chinese inputs. Approximately 70% of the APIs used by Indian manufacturers are imported from China. For critical antibiotics like cephalosporins and penicillin, India's dependence on China approaches 90%. Thus, the US reliance on Indian generics is, in reality, a transitive reliance on Chinese chemistry. If the supply of KSMs from China to India is disrupted, the production of generics in India stops, and the US pharmacy runs out of medicine. The dependency extends to the most common items in the medicine cabinet. Ibuprofen, the ubiquitous pain reliever found in millions of homes, relies heavily on Chinese production. China produces a massive share of the world's ibuprofen API, and even more critically, it dominates the supply of isobutylbenzene, the essential chemical precursor required to synthesize it. The journey of an ibuprofen tablet likely involves isobutylbenzene produced in a Chinese petrochemical facility, synthesized into API in a Chinese or Indian plant, and formulated into a tablet in the West. The synthesis of ibuprofen involves a process known as Friedel-Crafts acylation, which chemically bonds the isobutylbenzene to other reagents. This specific chemical step creates a rigid dependency on the precursor supply. There is no substitute ingredient that can simply be swapped in if isobutylbenzene is unavailable. The US Department of Commerce and various independent analyses have attempted to quantify this exposure, often finding conflicting data due to the classification of KSMs. While some studies suggest direct US reliance on Chinese APIs is around 13 to 25%, these figures largely ignore the KSM layer. When one accounts for the chemical precursors, the building blocks without which the API cannot be made, the effective reliance for many essential medicines approaches 100%. A 2025 analysis of the USP Medicine Supply Map found that for 37% of US-approved APIs, China is the sole supplier of at least one key starting material. This means that for more than a third of the drugs approved for use in the US, there is no alternative supply chain that does not pass through China. Furthermore, 12% of US-approved APIs rely on China for 100% of their KSM requirements. This concentration is not limited to old drugs. In 2024, China surpassed India as the top holder of new API drug master file fillings with the US FDA, accounting for 45% of new fillings compared to India's share. This metric is a leading indicator for future market share. It means that for the new drugs coming to market and for new generic versions of old drugs, Chinese companies are filing the paperwork to be the primary suppliers. This signals a shift from dominating the volume game, cheap antibiotics, to to dominating the value game. China is investing heavily in biotech-derived APIs, which are projected to grow at nearly 12% annually, indicating a strategic move into complex cancer drugs and biologics. This concentration of pharmaceutical power has profound strategic implications, transforming global health security from a collaborative endeavor into a geopolitical vulnerability. The centralization of supply in a single nation, particularly one that is increasingly viewed as a strategic rival to the West, introduces two distinct categories of risk: accidental disruption and intentional leverage. Accidental disruption and the fragility of efficiency. The most immediate threat is the lack of resilience in the face of accidents or natural disasters. The efficiency of the global supply chain, driven by just-in-time inventory practices and the consolidation of manufacturing into mega facilities, has stripped the system of redundancy. The 2016 explosion at the Chailu Pharmaceutical factory is a prime example of this fragility. Because Chailu was the dominant global supplier of the API for piperacillin tazobactam, a single industrial accident in Jinan caused a worldwide shortage of a critical hospital antibiotic. In a diversified market, other suppliers would absorb the shock. In a concentrated market, there is no buffer. The explosion involved a pressure vessel containing ethanol in a wastewater reclamation workshop, highlighting how even ancillary processes within these massive chemical parks can trigger global supply shocks. The blue sky policies enacted by Beijing in 2017 and 2018 to combat air pollution further demonstrated this volatility. The Chinese government, facing intense domestic pressure to clean up its environment, ordered the sudden closure of thousands of chemical plants that failed to meet emission standards. While environmentally necessary, this crackdown was executed with a blunt instrument. It shuttered countless small and medium-sized producers of KSMs and intermediates overnight. The result was a chaotic spike in global prices and shortages of vitamins and antibiotics, as the Western supply chain discovered that the obscure, dirty factories it had relied on were suddenly gone. This episode revealed a paradox. Environmental stewardship in China, without coordination with global supply needs, can threaten health security worldwide. The crackdown impacted the supply of methyl-2-pyrrolidone, NMP, and other solvents, rippling through supply chains that Western buyers didn't even realize originated in these specific Chinese provinces. Intentional leverage and weaponization. The darker strategic implication is the potential for weaponization of the medicine supply. Pharmaceutical exports have moved from being a purely commercial good to a potential lever of statecraft. In 2019, during heightened trade tensions, Chinese commentators and economists explicitly suggested that China could curb exports of antibiotic precursors as a countermeasure against U.S. tariffs. The logic articulated was stark. If you want to destroy us, just stop sending us antibiotics. While the Chinese state has not formally executed such a blockade as a matter of declared war, the mere existence of the capability alters the geopolitical calculus. This vulnerability was laid bare during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, as the virus ravaged Wuhan and Hubei province, a major hub for pharmaceutical manufacturing, the Chinese government nationalized control of medical supplies and restricted exports to ensure domestic sufficiency. This was not necessarily an act of malice, but of national survival. However, the downstream effect was that the United States and Europe faced immediate shortages of personal protective equipment, PPE, and feared imminent drug stockouts. It demonstrated that in a global crisis, nations will prioritize their own populations, and a country that relies on foreign powers for its essential medicines is essentially outsourcing its survival. The shutdown of Hubei province, home to thousands of medical equipment wholesalers and manufacturers, effectively turned off the tap for a significant portion of the world's medical supplies, creating a supply shock that rippled through U.S. hospitals. Opaque supply chain, a breeding ground for scandal. Concentration and opacity also breed quality failures. When supply chains are long, convoluted, and cost-pressured, the temptation to cut corners increases, and the ability of regulators to police the supply chain decreases. This was tragically illustrated in the 2008 heparin scandal. Heparin, a blood thinner derived from pig intestines, is essential for surgery and dialysis. A Chinese supplier, seeking to cut costs during a shortage of pig supply caused by blue ear pig disease, adulterated the raw heparin stock with oversulfated chondroitin sulfate, a synthetic mimic that was cheaper but toxic. Because the supply chain was opaque, with Western companies buying from consolidators who bought from unregulated workshops, the adulteration went undetected until it killed 81 people in the United States. The US FDA struggled to inspect the upstream Chinese facilities because many were registered as chemical plants rather than pharmaceutical manufacturers, placing them outside the standard regulatory purview until it was too late. Similarly, the 2018 valsartan recalls were triggered by the discovery of N-nitrosodimethylamine, a probable carcinogen, in APIs manufactured by Zhejiang Huahai Pharmaceutical. The contamination was not an act of sabotage, but the result of a change in the chemical manufacturing process intended to increase yield and reduce waste. The manufacturer had altered the synthesis route using a different solvent and reagent combination that inadvertently created the carcinogenic impurity. Western regulators were unaware of the risk because they did not fully understand the chemical implications of the process changes occurring in the Chinese factory. These incidents underscore that when control of the ingredients is lost, control over quality and safety is also lost. The distance in the supply chain is not just geographic, it is informational. Anatomy of a shortage. Amoxicillin 2022. To illustrate the abstract concepts of API dependency and the fragility of the supply chain, the 2022-2023 amoxicillin shortage provides a perfect, harrowing case study. Amoxicillin is not a complex biologic drug. It is a workhorse antibiotic, a derivative of penicillin that has been a staple of pediatric medicine for decades. Yet in late 2022, it virtually disappeared from pharmacies in the US and Europe. The shortage was triggered by a demand surge, the triple-demic of RSV, flu, and COVID-19. However, demand surges happen frequently in healthcare. The failure was on the supply side. The manufacturing of amoxicillin is distinct from other drugs because it requires fermentation, a biological process where mold is grown in massive vats to produce the starting material, penicillin G. This process is energy-intensive, water-hungry, and produces significant waste. Over the last 2 decades, Western facilities exited this business entirely. The last major U.S. plant, Bristol-Myers Squibb in Syracuse, exited in 2004. Today, the global production of penicillin G and its key derivative, 6-amino-penicillanic acid, 6-APA, is heavily concentrated in China. 6-APA is the critical key starting material for amoxicillin, ampicillin, and other beta-lactam antibiotics. It is the molecular skeleton upon which these drugs are built. Data from the USP Medicine Supply Map indicates that 100% of the 6-APA used to make amoxicillin for the US market originates from foreign sources, with the overwhelming majority coming from a handful of manufacturers in China. When the demand spiked in 2022, the bottleneck was not just in the final pill factories in the US or Europe, it was deep upstream in the 6-APA capacity in China. Energy constraints, environmental checks, and pandemic-related disruptions in China had tightened the supply of this precursor. The just-in-time inventory model used by generic drug manufacturers meant there was no buffer stock of 6-APA. Manufacturers in India and Europe could not simply ramp up production because they could not get enough of the starting material. The result was a cascading failure. U.S. pharmacists were left helpless, unable to fill prescriptions for sick children because a factory in Shandong province couldn't ship enough white powder to a factory in India, which couldn't ship enough API to a factory in New Jersey. This case study reveals the fallacy of diversification that looks only at the final pill. A patient might see amoxicillin brands from Teva, Israel, Sandoz, Switzerland, and Aurobindo, India, and assume the market is diverse. But if all three companies buy their 6-APA from the same Chinese supplier, the diversity is an illusion. The control of the ingredient dictates the cure. Regulatory gray zone of KSMs. A central theme in the loss of control over pharmaceutical ingredients is the regulatory ambiguity surrounding key starting materials, KSMs. As noted in industry analyses, the designation of what constitutes a KSM is often a matter of debate between manufacturers and regulators. In an ideal world, the starting material would be defined very early in the synthesis process, bringing more of the chemical journey under the strict umbrella of good manufacturing practices, GMP. GMP requires rigorous documentation, cleanliness standards, and quality control. However, these standards are expensive. There is a strong economic incentive for manufacturers to push the KSM designation as far downstream as possible. If a chemical synthesis has 10 steps and the manufacturer can convince the FDA that the starting material is actually the intermediate created at step 8, then steps 1 through 7 can be conducted in non-GMP chemical plants. These plants are cheaper to run, have less oversight, and can source raw materials from the lowest bidder without the same level of traceability. This late designation of KSMs creates a regulatory blind spot. It means that the FDA and EMA often have little visibility into the early stages of the supply chain. A non-GMP facility in China could change its solvent supplier, alter its waste treatment process, or modify its synthesis route to save money, potentially introducing impurities. Because this happens in the pre-KSM dark zone, regulators may not know about it until the contaminated drug reaches the patient. China's dominance is particularly strong in this pre-KSM space. The country's massive chemical infrastructure allows it to produce these early-stage intermediates at a scale and cost that no other country can match. Even if the US or Europe succeeds in reshoring API manufacturing, if the new domestic factories still import their KSMs and non-GMP intermediates from China, the dependency remains. The control of the ingredient has simply moved one step back in the chain, but it has not changed hands. Reconfiguration of global health security. For the better part of 3 decades, the global pharmaceutical industry operated under a singular overarching directive: the pursuit of relentless efficiency. This drive for cost optimization created a gravitational pull that fundamentally reshaped the geography of medicine, shifting the production of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, and key starting materials, or KSMs, away from the industrial heartlands of the West and toward the rising manufacturing superpowers of the East, most notably China. This era, often characterized by the just-in-time delivery of chemical precursors, delivered undeniable benefits in the form of commoditized, affordable generic medicines that saved millions of lives globally. However, the foundational logic of this system, centralized production for a globalized market, has collapsed under the weight of geopolitical friction, pandemic-induced supply shocks, and a renewed understanding of national security. We are now living through the early years of a comprehensive reconstruction of the global health architecture. The narrative that dominated the early 2020s, which focused almost exclusively on the vulnerability of relying on Beijing, has evolved into a far more complex and proactive story. By 2025 and 2026, the world is no longer simply reacting to the risk of Chinese dominance, it is actively building a multipolar pharmaceutical order. This new landscape is defined by the rise of alternative power centers, each vying for control over the molecules that underpin modern medicine. From the fermentation vats of Hyderabad to the high-tech chemical parks of the Rhine-Ruhr, and from the regulatory corridors of Brussels to the emerging biotech zones of Vietnam, a new map of influence is being drawn. This review provides an exhaustive analysis of this transformation. It moves beyond the headlines of trade wars to explore the intricate machinery of this shift, the specific government incentives redrawing investment flows, the resurrection of dormant chemical capabilities in the West, the strategic alliances bridging the Indian Ocean, and the unseen dependencies on critical minerals that threaten to create new bottlenecks. This is not merely a story of economics, it is a chronicle of how nations are reclaiming the sovereignty to heal their populations, building a system where resilience is prioritized over rock-bottom pricing, and where the control of a chemical supply chain is recognized as a lever of geopolitical power equal to that of energy or semiconductors. United States, the high cost of resilience and the return of industrial policy. The United States, having pioneered the scientific breakthroughs that define modern pharmacology, found itself in the precarious position of being largely unable to manufacture the basic inputs required to produce them. The realization that the U.S. supply chain for essential generics, antibiotics, sedatives, and basic injectables was dangerously brittle triggered a paradigm shift in Washington. By 2025, the U.S. government had moved beyond mere rhetoric, deploying a suite of executive authorities, fiscal instruments, and trade policies designed to force a repatriation of pharmaceutical manufacturing. Central to the American strategy is the recognition that financial incentives alone are insufficient to overcome the structural cost disadvantages of domestic manufacturing. In May 2025, the administration issued the executive order titled Regulatory Relief to Promote Domestic Production of Critical Medicines, a directive that fundamentally altered the operational landscape for manufacturers. This order was born from industry feedback, highlighting that the construction of a new pharmaceutical plant in the United States could take 5 to 10 years due to a thicket of federal, state, and local regulations. The order mandated the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, to streamline the permitting process, effectively fast-tracking facilities deemed essential to national security. This regulatory relief was accompanied by a concerted effort to level the playing field regarding oversight. For years, domestic manufacturers contended that they operated under a microscope of unannounced FDA inspections, while their foreign competitors faced infrequent, pre-announced visits that allowed for preparation and obfuscation. The 2025 directive ordered a rebalancing of this inspection regime, increasing the frequency of foreign facility audits and imposing stricter data reporting requirements. This move was designed to erode the regulatory arbitrage that had incentivized offshoring, making the cost of compliance in India or China more reflective of the rigorous standards demanded in the United States. Perhaps the most tangible manifestation of this new security mindset was the operationalization of the Strategic Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients Reserve, SAPIR. Established firmly by an August 2025 executive order, SAPIR represents a conceptual leap from stockpiling finished doses to stockpiling the chemical potential to create them. Unlike the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which stores a raw, stable commodity, SAPIR requires the storage of labile chemical compounds that degrade over time. The 2025 order directed the Department of Health and Human Services to not only maintain existing reserves, but to finalize plans for a second SAPIR repository within 12 months. This initiative provides a crucial buffer, ensuring that in the event of a blockade or a pandemic-induced logistics collapse, the United States possesses the raw materials to keep its tablet presses running for months rather than days. The American strategy has not been without significant internal conflict, particularly regarding the use of tariffs. In the broader context of trade policy, the administration signaled a willingness to impose tariffs on pharmaceutical imports to protect nascent domestic industries. However, this approach collided with the economic realities of the generic drug market. Generic medicines, which constitute 90% of prescriptions filled in the U.S., but only account for roughly 13% of total drug spend, operate on razor-thin margins. Manufacturers of these drugs cannot absorb a 25% tariff on imported ingredients. The costs must be passed on or the product discontinued. Analysts from the Budget Lab at Yale University in 2025 quantified this impact, projecting that a blanket 25% tariff could raise the annual medication cost for an average American household by approximately $600. Critics of the tariff strategy, including public health experts and supply chain analysts, argued that tariffs are a blunt instrument ill-suited for the nuanced web of pharmaceutical trade. They contended that while tariffs might punish foreign suppliers, they do not magically conjure domestic capacity overnight. Instead, they risk precipitating immediate shortages of essential medicines, like sterile injectables and chemotherapy agents, before domestic alternatives can come online. The industry consensus emerged that reshoring the low-margin generic sector required pull incentives, long-term guaranteed purchase contracts, rather than just the push of punitive taxes. A profound tension sits at the heart of U.S. pharmaceutical policy in the mid-2020s. The conflict between the political imperative to lower drug prices and the strategic imperative to increase capital investment in manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, which empowered Medicare to negotiate prices for high-spend drugs starting in 2026, fundamentally altered the revenue outlook for the industry. While the Congressional Budget Office estimated these negotiations would save the federal government nearly $100 billion over a decade, pharmaceutical companies argued that this revenue extraction directly competed with the capital required for reshoring. This phenomenon, described by economists as the capital allocation trade-off, posits that companies facing reduced margins on their blockbuster drugs have less free cash flow to invest in the low-return infrastructure of domestic manufacturing. Building a state-of-the-art fermentation plant in the U.S. requires hundreds of millions of dollars in upfront capital. If the internal rate of return on such projects is compressed by price controls or the threat of future negotiations, boards of directors are less likely to approve them. Reports from late 2025 indicated that this uncertainty was already influencing corporate behavior, with some firms hesitating to commit to greenfield projects in the U.S. despite the political pressure, preferring instead to invest in jurisdictions with more predictable long-term pricing environments. India, the pharmacy of the world, redefines its sovereignty. If the United States is struggling to rebuild lost capacity, India is fighting to secure the massive capacity it already possesses. Long hailed as the pharmacy of the world for its dominance in the export of finished generic drugs, India faced a critical vulnerability: its overwhelming dependence on China for the chemical building blocks of those medicines. For years, nearly 70% of the key starting materials, KSMs, and APIs used by Indian manufacturers were imported from China. In a geopolitical crisis, India's pharmaceutical prowess could be effectively neutralized by cutting off this upstream supply. To counter this dependency, the Indian government launched the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, a massive subsidy program designed to jumpstart the domestic production of critical KSMs and APIs. By late 2025, this scheme had evolved from a policy document into a concrete industrial reality. As of September 2025, the scheme had catalyzed investments worth 40,294 crore rupees, a figure that exceeded the government's initial targets by a significant margin. This capital injection facilitated the commissioning of over 350 manufacturing units, including 28 greenfield projects dedicated to synthesizing molecules that had not been produced in India for decades. The most striking success of the PLI scheme was in the resurrection of the fermentation industry. The production of fermentation-based intermediates, such as penicillin G and rifampicin, is energy-intensive and technically complex. China had established a near monopoly in this sector due to scale and state support. The PLI scheme specifically targeted these vulnerabilities, offering incentives that made Indian production viable. By 2025, India had commenced the commercial production of penicillin G, marking a symbolic and strategic victory in its quest for self-reliance. This domestic capacity acts as a strategic insurance policy, protecting not just India's healthcare system, but also the global markets that rely on Indian exports from upstream supply shocks. The economic data from 2025 underscores the scale of this transformation. Products manufactured under the PLI scheme contributed to 30% of India's overall bulk drug exports and over a quarter of its formulation exports. Moreover, the scheme generated employment for nearly 97,000 people, embedding the pharmaceutical sector even deeper into the country's socio-economic fabric. This success has emboldened the Indian government to expand the scope of its industrial ambition, targeting higher value segments such as biopharmaceuticals and complex generics. India's drive for pharmaceutical independence has been turbocharged by its deepening strategic partnership with the United States. Recognizing that neither nation could fully decouple from China alone, Washington and New Delhi forged a series of agreements to integrate their supply chains. The Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, ICET, laid the groundwork, which was further elevated in February 2025 with the launch of the US-India Trust, Transforming the Relationship Utilizing Strategic Technology initiative. The Trust Initiative is explicitly designed to optimize the biopharmaceutical supply chain between the two nations. For the United States, India represents the only viable alternative to China that possesses the scale to meet American demand for generic medicines. The initiative focuses on friendshoring, encouraging U.S. companies to source KSMs and APIs from Indian manufacturers. In return, the U.S. provides technical assistance to help Indian firms navigate FDA regulations and improve their quality standards. This partnership is mutually beneficial. It reduces U.S. reliance on China while providing Indian manufacturers with the lucrative U.S. market, incentivizing them to upgrade their capabilities. The collaboration also extends to the joint development of new manufacturing techniques, aiming to leapfrog traditional batch processing with continuous manufacturing techniques that are cleaner and more efficient. However, this partnership is not without friction. Persistent concerns regarding intellectual property protection and the environmental impact of rapid industrial expansion in India remain. The U.S. continues to push for higher standards, while Indian manufacturers grapple with the capital costs of compliance. Yet the overarching geopolitical alignment ensures that these issues are managed as technical hurdles rather than strategic roadblocks. European Union, strategic autonomy through regulatory power. While the US focuses on reshoring and India on self-reliance, the European Union has adopted a strategy defined by strategic autonomy, the ability to act independently when necessary while remaining open to trade. Europe's approach leverages its status as a regulatory superpower to reshape global supply chains, incentivizing resilience through standards and trade agreements rather than purely through subsidies. The cornerstone of the EU's internal strategy is the Critical Medicines Alliance, CMA, established in 2024, and the subsequent Critical Medicines Act proposed in 2025. These initiatives represent a fundamental shift in how Europe manages its health security. The Critical Medicines Act mandates a comprehensive mapping of supply chain vulnerabilities, requiring member states to identify medicines of common interest and ensure their availability through stockpiling and diversified sourcing. Crucially, the EU has attacked the root cause of supply fragility, the procurement process. For decades, European public health systems awarded tenders solely based on price. This winner-takes-all race to the bottom drove European manufacturers out of the market and concentrated supply in the hands of the lowest-cost Asian producers. The new EU directive rewrites these rules, mandating the inclusion of qualitative criteria in procurement tenders. Security of supply, environmental sustainability, and social standards are now weighted factors in awarding contracts. This policy effectively creates a market premium for medicines produced in Europe or by reliable partners, subsidizing resilience through the healthcare budget. By paying a slightly higher price for a secure supply, Europe aims to maintain a viable domestic manufacturing base for critical medicines. In January 2026, the European Union and India concluded a landmark free trade agreement, FTA, that stands as the most significant external maneuver in Europe's pharmaceutical strategy. Negotiated against a backdrop of rising global protectionism, this agreement is a deliberate attempt to create a China-free corridor for pharmaceutical trade. The deal creates a massive integrated market, but its technical provisions regarding pharmaceuticals are particularly transformative. The FTA eliminates tariffs on over 90% of tariff lines, including the removal of duties on Indian pharmaceuticals and chemicals that previously faced tariffs of up to 11% and 22% respectively. This liberalization is phased over 5 to 7 years, giving European industry time to adjust while signaling a long-term commitment to Indian supply. More importantly, the agreement addresses technical barriers to trade. By aligning regulatory standards and facilitating mutual recognition of inspections where possible, the FTA reduces the friction that has historically hampered Indian exports to Europe. For the EU, this deal secures access to a massive manufacturing base for generics. For India, it validates its industry's quality and opens the door to the world's most regulated market. Germany and Switzerland, the fortresses of high-value chemistry. Within the broader European context, Germany and Switzerland occupy a distinct and critical tier in the global supply chain. They have not attempted to compete with Asia on volume or price for commodity generics. Instead, they have doubled down on their historical strengths: complex chemistry, specialized precursors, and high-value biotechnology. Germany remains the industrial engine of Europe, and its chemical sector is organized around the unique concept of the Verbund, integrated chemical parks where companies are physically interconnected. In these parks, the byproduct of one factory becomes the feedstock for another, creating a closed-loop system of extreme efficiency and low waste. This ecosystem allows German manufacturers to remain globally competitive in the production of specialized pharmaceutical precursors and fine chemicals, despite higher labor costs. In 2025, German industry accelerated its adoption of flow chemistry and digitalization. Unlike traditional batch manufacturing, where chemical reactions occur in large vats, flow chemistry involves continuous reactions in small pipes, allowing for precise control over dangerous or unstable reactions. This technology is essential for synthesizing the complex molecules required for modern oncology and immunology drugs. By automating these processes and integrating them with AI-driven quality control, German firms have created a quality fortress that Asian competitors struggle to breach. This dominance in the upstream synthesis of complex intermediates ensures that Germany remains an indispensable node in the global supply chain, supplying the critical ingredients that other nations formulate into finished drugs. Switzerland operates as a specialized hub for the highest value segment of the pharmaceutical market, biologics and cell therapies. The Swiss model is exemplified by contract development and manufacturing organizations like Lonza. These companies do not merely manufacture drugs, they co-develop the manufacturing processes for novel therapies. The strategic importance of facilities like Lonza's site in Visp cannot be overstated. It was here that the manufacturing process for the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine was scaled up, and it is here that the next generation of mRNA therapies for cancer are being produced. The Swiss strategy focuses on complexity as a barrier to entry. By specializing in therapies that require intricate supply chains, cold chain logistics, and highly skilled personnel, Switzerland insulates itself from cost competition. The country serves as the global cockpit for biopharmaceutical innovation, orchestrating a supply network that draws raw materials from around the world but keeps the most critical value-adding steps within its borders. This ensures that while mass-market antibiotics may be made elsewhere, the cures for the most difficult diseases remain a Swiss export. Japan, the silent giant of specialized ingredients. Japan's role in the global pharmaceutical supply chain is often understated, but technically vital. While the country imports a significant volume of finished generic medicines, it retains a dominant position in the production of high-purity chemical precursors, specialized lipids, and advanced pharmaceutical intermediates. Japanese chemical companies have leveraged their heritage in material science to corner the market on specific high-value niches. For instance, the global supply of nucleic acid medicines, therapies based on DNA or RNA, relies heavily on specialized amino acids and lipids produced in Japan. These materials must be manufactured to an exceptional degree of purity to ensure patient safety, a requirement that aligns perfectly with the Japanese industrial ethos of monozukuri, craftsmanship. Companies like Ajinomoto and others have pivoted from food ingredients to become indispensable suppliers of these biopharma raw materials. Furthermore, the Japanese government has actively shaped this ecosystem through regulatory reform. The Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, MHWL, has streamlined approval processes for orphan drugs, medicines for rare diseases, and pediatric therapies. This regulatory agility incentivizes Japanese companies to focus on niche, high-value markets where they can maintain pricing power. The result is a bifurcated market. Japan imports commoditized drugs but exports the critical high-tech components required to make the world's most advanced therapies. The Japanese industry is also undergoing a significant structural transformation driven by mergers and acquisitions. The acquisition of Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma by Bain Capital for $3.4 billion in 2024-2025 signaled a new era of aggressive global expansion. This move was predicated on the belief that Japanese R&D assets were undervalued and could be scaled globally. Similarly, Takeda Pharmaceutical's transformation into a top-tier global multinational demonstrates the ambition of Japanese firms to operate beyond their domestic market. By integrating global supply chains and establishing a presence in the US and Europe, these companies serve as bridges, channeling Japanese technical excellence into global markets. Japan also plays a pivotal role in the cold chain, the temperature-controlled logistics required for biologics. As pharmaceutical products become more sensitive to temperature, Japan's advanced logistics infrastructure has become a critical service export. The ability to transport a living cell therapy from a factory in Tokyo to a patient in Texas without a single degree of temperature deviation is a capability that few nations possess, further cementing Japan's status as a logistical superpower in the health sector. Emerging fronts: the rise of the Global South. Beyond the established industrial powers, a new tier of players is emerging in the Global South, driven by the twin imperatives of economic diversification and health security. These nations are not content to remain mere consumers of Western or Chinese medicines. They are building the capacity to produce their own. Vietnam is rapidly positioning itself as the China +1 destination of choice for pharmaceutical manufacturing in Southeast Asia. With a pharmaceutical market projected to reach $11.6 billion by 2033, the country offers a compelling mix of growing domestic demand and a favorable investment climate. The Vietnamese government has set aggressive targets. By 2030, it aims for domestic manufacturers to meet 80% of national drug demand and to produce 20% of required raw materials locally. To achieve this, Vietnam has established specialized industrial zones, such as the Biotech High-Tech Park in Hanoi, launched in August 2025. These zones offer tax incentives, streamlined bureaucracy, and ready-made infrastructure to attract foreign direct investment. Vietnam's strategy mirrors its success in electronics. Leverage low labor costs and free trade agreements, such as the EVFTA with Europe, to integrate into global value chains. While currently focused on generics, the presence of global multinationals and the upgrading of local firms suggest that Vietnam is swiftly moving up the value chain. In Latin America, Brazil stands as the undisputed leader in pharmaceutical capacity. Supported by a massive internal market and the public purchasing power of the Unified Health System (SUS), Brazil has built a robust industrial base. The Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, is a member of the International Council for Harmonization, ICH, meaning its standards are aligned with the FDA and EMA. This regulatory convergence makes Brazil an attractive partner for global companies looking to nearshore production for the Americas. The Brazilian government has reinvigorated its health economic industrial strategy, using state purchasing power to incentivize local production of strategic APIs and biologics. By offering long-term contracts to companies that commit to technology transfer and local manufacturing, Brazil is reducing its import dependence and establishing itself as a regional export hub. Perhaps the most morally urgent transformation is occurring in Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic, characterized by vaccine nationalism where wealthy nations hoarded supplies, left a deep scar on the continent's psyche. In response, the African Union launched a bold initiative to manufacture 60% of Africa's vaccine needs locally by 2040. This is not just an aspirational goal, it is being operationalized through the African Pooled Procurement Mechanism, APPM. The APPM, endorsed in 2024, aggregates the demand of African Union member states. By negotiating as a collective bloc, African nations can offer manufacturers the scale and volume guarantees necessary to make local production economically viable. This mechanism addresses the market fragmentation that historically deterred investment. Supported by international partners like Gavi and the World Bank, which are deploying financial instruments to de-risk these investments, Africa is building a distributed network of vaccine manufacturing hubs. From Senegal to South Africa, new facilities are rising, designed to ensure that in the next pandemic, Africa will not be at the back of the queue. The hidden wars, critical minerals and logistics. Beneath the visible trade in chemical compounds lies a deeper, more opaque layer of dependency, the reliance on critical minerals. Modern medical technology is voracious for specific elements. Lithium is essential for portable medical devices and batteries. Rare earth elements like gadolinium are critical for MRI contrast agents, and platinum group metals are used in everything from pacemakers to chemotherapy drugs. As the pharmaceutical supply chain diversifies, it is colliding with the reality that the supply of these minerals remains heavily concentrated, often in China. The green transition, which needs these minerals for EVs and wind turbines, and the health security transition are competing for the same finite resources. This competition is driving a new wave of geopolitical maneuvering as nations scramble to secure access to mines in Africa, South America, and Australia. The security of the pharmaceutical supply chain is thus inextricably linked to the mining sector, expanding the definition of health security to include geology. Furthermore, the logistics of this new dispersed network present a formidable challenge. Moving high-value, temperature-sensitive biologics across a fragmented global network requires a cold chain of unbroken refrigeration. Any breach in this chain renders the medicine useless. Japan and specialized logistics firms in Europe are leading the development of smart shipping containers equipped with real-time IoT sensors to monitor integrity. In this new era, the shipping container is as important as the factory. Without the ability to move these fragile molecules safely, the diversified supply chain fails. The year 2025 and the beginning of 2026 mark the end of the era of pharmaceutical innocence. The world has woken up to the fact that the supply chain for life-saving medicines is a strategic asset, a critical infrastructure that cannot be left solely to the whims of the free market or the dominance of a single geopolitical rival. The response has been a massive coordinated effort to redraw the map of production. This new geometry of power is multipolar. It rests on the industrial resurgence of the United States, the strategic autonomy of Europe, the sovereign ambition of India, the technical mastery of Japan and the DACH region, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the rising capabilities of the Global South. It is a system built on redundancy rather than efficiency, on resilience rather than lowest cost. The transition is expensive. It will likely result in structurally higher drug prices and a more complex regulatory environment. It introduces new risks from the inflationary pressure of tariffs to the capital trade-offs facing innovation. Yet it promises a more secure world, a world where the ability to heal a population is not dependent on a single supply line stretching across a contested ocean. As these new factories come online and new trade routes are forged, the control of pharmaceutical ingredients has become one of the defining frontiers of the 21st century statecraft. The molecule is no longer just a unit of medicine, it is a unit of power.